Our focus is to shed light on the systematic barriers, including racism and misogyny, that prevent these artists from gaining equal exposure and recognitions within visual arts through reading groups, film screenings, performance, workshops, and symposia. We aim to create thinking spaces that will unpack notions of invisibility and disenchantment and identity strategies for redressing this imbalance. As a research group, we believe that disenchantment and invisibility are not simply a result of lack of exposure or representation, but are deeply rooted in systemic inequalities and power dynamics. Our research group attempts to challenge these dynamics to contribute to a more inclusive and equitable art world, which in itself is crucial for the growth and advancement of British cultural landscape by bringing together artists, writers, curators, academics, and researchers. We aim to generate new channels of thinking and networking that will contribute towards the development of British art curating, for example, generating material and networks leading to a new exhibition of contemporary artists' work. And the project will be archived within the Slade School of Fine Art. So I will now introduce Tamsin Hong. Tamsin Hong grew up in the land now known as Australia during the toxic anti-Asian climate of the 1990s. This provided the scaffolding on which her curatorial practice hangs. On one hand, her existence was part of the ongoing colonial project in Australia. On the other, her Chinese ancestors too had been dislocated from their lands by British colonial activities. What has become increasingly apparent since she moved to London is how Asian artists, curators, and other creatives share specific dynamics, including alienations from each other because of the divide and conquer system, which continues today. So her meditation focuses on whether it might be possible for us to undivide ourselves and what strategies can we invoke as part of this practice. So thank you, Tamsin, and over to you now.
Thank you kindly, Jasmine, for the introduction, and thank you all for welcoming me into this space and for spending some time this afternoon. And just to say that I'm currently speaking live from the Serpentine Gallery where I work. I'm exhibitions curator, and we've just opened the Georg Baselitz exhibition downstairs. I used to work at Tate Modern, focusing on performance, African and Australian art. And you can probably tell from my accent, I am not from here. I am from the place now known as Australia. And I'm delighted to be discussing with you a little bit about my career and the specificity of what it's like to be raised in a place that is continuing the colonial project, in hopes that by sharing the specifics of my experience of becoming a curator and ending up in London, that you might also see some similarities. So yes, I've put a question mark around the term British because there's always that question of what is British? And I quite like the way in which current thinking around the concept of Britain often expands into the places of British influence and British violence. And I feel that this is really important to be considering about how British culture has expanded to what we now know as Australia. And if we go to the next slide, I found this on the web. This is a massive sign you see on your way into Canberra from New South Wales. You'll notice that there's that state was named very clearly after a country that had been colonized by the English. And this is a sign that declares Canberra on Ngunnawal country as the sister city of Nara, Japan, Beijing, China, and the friendship city of Dili, East Timor. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show you where Canberra is for those of you who have not ventured to the massive island continent. It's a bit blurry, but if you have a look at that big map, that this is the Indigenous map of Australia, and this shows the over 300 languages and nations that make up the continent and the island underneath, which is now known as Tasmania. And you'll see that this is a huge area, and there are many language groups, and you'll see where the nations bunch up quite a lot along the coast. But where I'm from, Ngunnawal country, it's inland. So I've just given you a zoom in there. It's from the southeast of Australia, about 3 hours southwest of Sydney and 5 hours north of Melbourne. And this is very important because Canberra is the national capital, and it was created at a time when modern states were building their new cities. So Washington, D.C., for instance, New Zealand created Wellington. These were places that were meant to be strategic, places that were difficult to invade. And of course, at the time that they were building it, they didn't realize that air power was on the rise. So it's a bit strange now that we've got this inland city, and it's known for its 4 distinctive seasons. It can get very cold in winter, down to -10 degrees, and it can get very hot in summer, usually in its 40s. And it's known as the bush capital. So Canberra is the meeting place, and it sits on Ngunnawal country, and the custodians have lived there for over 65,000 years that we know of. So if you go to the next slide, I'm telling you a little bit about my history. The photograph on the left, it's so exquisitely awkward. This is me at Bruce Hall at the Australian National University, and it's actually before I start studying art history. At the time, I'm studying international relations in hopes that I might be able to create a career on cultural exchange. And not long after this photograph is taken, I realized that international relations, at least what I was learning, was about how major countries are using their military and economic power to strong arm smaller nations. And I found that deeply problematic. You also notice in both of these photographs, I've messed with my hair. I've actually got very, like you can't see it right now, but I've got very curly hair. And I'm pointing this out because I had huge identity problems at the time. I've straightened my hair in both of these photographs, or glossed it using a GHD. You can see the box in the background. You can see how messy my room is. You can see my OCD scheduling with all of my lectures there as well. And I'm wearing my mother's cheongsam from 1980s Hong Kong, not long after she and my dad got together, and not long before I was brought into the world. And I look at this photograph and I know that I'm feeling very awkward in this dress. We talked a little bit about the toxic environment of the 90s in Australia. There was a particular political party called One Nation, which was led by Pauline Hanson, who's known for her red hair and extremely strong Australian accent. And she declared in Parliament that this country has been swamped by Asians. Now, my family were part of Australia's history during the White Australia policy, where non-Europeans were not allowed to become citizens of Australia until the 70s. And my grandfather and my grandmother got together in the 50s. He's from Singapore and of Chinese heritage. And it was after the Japanese invasion of Singapore that, as part of the rebuilding of the country, they sent their students abroad rather than educating them at the university. And my grandfather got a scholarship to Australia, where he met my grandmother, and they had to move with all their children, including my dad, back to Singapore because they couldn't stay in the country. The photograph on the right is when I finally realized that I actually can't study international relations, and I desperately wanted to study art history. Many of you will have this shared experience of, the migrant family anxiety. I desperately wanted to study international relations because I thought it might make my dad happy, as it was a more lucrative role than the arts. But ever since I was about 14, I had these yearly arguments with my dad, and unfortunately they still continue today about being in the arts. And what's interesting here in this photograph is in the back left, you will see Monet's haystacks. And this is from the National Gallery of Australia's collection. And the reason why I'm drawing it to your attention is I think many of us will have a shared experience of not really seeing our cultural inheritance until we go looking for it. And so here I am desperately proving myself as an art history student with Monet proudly on my bedroom wall. If we look at the next slide, you'll see that that story I'm telling you isn't quite the whole picture. Though that haystack is proudly on the cover of Monet in Japan, the catalogue on the left there. And this exhibition had a profound impact on me. The National Gallery of Australia, which is in Canberra and was my local gallery, has one of the most exquisite collections in the world. And I say that as a former Tate curator. I'm astonished, going back last year, I realized that the National Gallery of Australia was collecting works by artists that Tate is only collecting now. Incredibly forward-thinking curators were bringing together an amazing collection. And when I was a small girl, they had opened up the Asian wing of the National Gallery. Now, the National Gallery's curators were all white at the time, but the collection was quite extraordinary. And of the many Monet, etc. collection displays and exhibitions that they have, I mean, it's almost every year they have Monet and something, Turner to Monet, or some sort of Monet related exhibition. But the Monet in Japan exhibition was really transformative for me. It was the moment when I learned about how Japanese art, and here we have Hokusai's Great Wave, how that influenced the Impressionists, including Monet. And I've never forgotten the experience of seeing that exhibition and learning a little bit about how Asia has always been part of that story of modern art. And it planted a seed that I wouldn't return to until much later on. But I think, that awkwardness that I was speaking of, I think I was so keen to try and meet the demands of what my family were expecting of me. I was a first-generation university student, and I was desperately trying to fit in. There were no other people of color in my course. It was completely white. And so I felt quite alone in that experience. And in my attempts to try and fit in, I didn't really embrace my connections with Asia. And one part of me really wishes I'd studied Asian studies, which ANU is quite famous for. It's one of the strongest universities exploring its role, its position within the broader Asian context. But if we go to the next slide, I can touch a little bit on my most, what's the word I'm looking for? Read paper, Angkor Wat, Hinduism, Politics and Prestige, which was an undergraduate essay that I happened to do quite well at, and I published it. It was, I can't remember if it was my first or second year, and it was part of this fantastic course called Southeast Asian Art and Architecture. And I just, it was a great opportunity to lean into my curiosity, and now it's used as a model text on how to do a very basic undergraduate essay. And I'm delighted that it was this particular essay that looked at the transnational history of Angkor Wat and how this amazing symbol of Cambodia had evolved over many generations through different religious focuses. And so this very short essay encapsulates that. And I think is the beginning of me starting to think a little bit more critically about my relationship to Asian identity. I was very lucky to work at the National Portrait Gallery of Australia, right from when I was an undergraduate student. And this work is of Dr. Chun-Yu, who is a fantastic children's doctor. And here he is portrayed by Ajan, who escaped China after everything that happened at Tiananmen Square. And he's recreated Dr. Chun-Yu as the Buddha, and this is a very lucky symbol of children climbing over the sculpture of Buddha. And so it's a very fitting portrait of Dr. Chun-Yu by a fellow Chinese expat. And he apparently had to sit very still for many hours whilst this cast was laid on him to create this porcelain portrait. And here is Lindy Lee, who I will return to in a moment. And she is photographed by her husband, Rob. And this work won the National Photographic Portrait Prize in 2007. The interesting thing about being Asian at the National Portrait Gallery of Australia was I often felt like I had to find ways to sneak in Asian portraits into my program as a learning facilitator, where I worked across visitor experience, public program, and learning. Because in Australia, much like here, there isn't enough of a conversation about where Asian identity fits. We often are sitting between non-Indigeneity, which is homogenized as white Australia, and Black Australia, which is under the auspices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. And so the multiculturalism of Australia is only recently, I feel, finding a voice within national consciousness. But even then, whenever there's a racial crisis, it tends to sit within this black and white simplicity. So these were some of the ways in which I was able to experience that broader expat psychology through my work at the National Portrait Gallery. But often, if I was looking at diversity, I had to look at it through the lens of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. And this was something that was really important whilst I was Assistant Curator of Military Heraldry and Technology at the Australian War Memorial, where I worked very closely with Garth O'Connell, who's an Aboriginal curator and brilliant thinker around Australian war history. But it was very difficult in that time to think about anything to do with Asia. And as you can see here, this is from the Australian War Memorials collection, and it's of our participation in the Vietnam War. Australia is the only country in the world that has participated in every single war that the United States has been involved in, and so it's a quite a terrifying space to be in. And I'm going to come back to Vietnam in a moment. And I think one of the things that I found difficult was that my voice wasn't being heard in Australia. And so I came to the UK to study because I felt that if I had the most colonial degree possible, then maybe my voice might be heard when I was talking about creating greater diversity in visual arts and culture as a young curator. And it's interesting, even though I never thought of myself as an Asian curator, Asian art would always sink in. And my most successful paper whilst I was doing my master's at Oxford University was this one on Muran Sukumaran, who was executed for drug smuggling in Indonesia. And there's a lot more to say about Muran's work. But during his 10 years on death row, he became an extraordinary artist, and his portraits of himself in the lead up to his execution were a way of reorienting the conversation that was happening in press from him being othered, and racism played a massive factor in the conversation around his life sentence and death sentence. but reorienting it towards him as an artist. And here on the left, we can see one of his final portraits, where he's thinking about the fact that he is about to be executed by gunshot. So an absolutely terrifying concept, and something that we don't really talk enough about in Australia, about him as an artist. But I was very interested in the socio-political context of his work. And it's something that I hope I will return to in the future. And then I managed to get my job as assistant curator of performance at Tate in 2019. I'd always planned to go back to Australia, and I haven't managed to do that yet. Maybe that'll happen in the future. I'd been working on performance for a long time. It was my research passion, and I did my honours thesis on Carolee Schneemann well before many other people were writing about her. And so I couldn't believe it when I managed to get the dream job. And of course I was going to stay in London for that. And I was starting to work with Lee Ming Wei, and this is one of the last photographs I've taken before the pandemic hit. And I was deeply isolated during that time and by myself in Brixton, as my flatmates moved back home. And the reason why I bring this up is because Lee Ming Wei, Taiwanese artist, his practice is rooted in Buddhism. And I found his energy to be one of the most beautiful I'd ever encountered. And I asked him about that, and he explained to me that he meditated every day. So in that extraordinary crisis, I turned to meditation. And that was the beginning of my own Buddhist practice. Practicing in the teachings of the Buddha. And I followed the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, who my mother introduced me to. And I find this very important because my mother, apart from the cheongsam that I was wearing of hers, she would sometimes talk about some of the difficulties we had with identity politics in our family as being something that was rooted in Asianness. So if my dad was very angry, it was because he was Asian. And this is something that I absorbed. And one of the things that's been very healing and important for me is that my mother accidentally brought me to Thich Nhat Hanh. He's a Vietnamese monk. And him and Ming Wei, they brought in a different idea of Asian masculinity into my life, and ideas around beauty and serenity that are really important. There's so much more to say on that, but I'm just going to move on to the next slide. So yes, pandemic hits. Ming Wei and I are working together for 4 years, when we're finally able to stage this work, Our Labyrinth, which is a meditative performance where dancers continually sweep grains of rice. There's an element of chance to Ming Wei's work. And the rice, of course, is very important in East Asian culture. This dancer here, Ayasone, she said to me that in kanji, rice is symbolized by 88. And it means that by the time the rice reaches her bowl, 88 hands have carried that rice to it in the turbine hall. So you can see the scale of this piece. And Ming Wei thought about yin and yang concepts of masculinity and femininity, the masculine space of the turbine hall, and then creating this very gentle pool of ink, which is represented by that black mat on which these two incredible dancers move in very slow and meditative ways. And this was such a beautiful work. We'd thought about it in so many different ways, what we would do if the pandemic hit us with more social distancing, etc. And so this was the healing work that we were able to release to members of the public last April, May, when the final social distancing measures were lifted. And these are photographs taken this week. I've now moved to Serpentine, and my first project is Georg Baselitz's Sculptures 2011 to 2015. And I spent some time thinking about this work. You can see BDM Group behind us. It's downstairs in Serpentine South. And, Baselitz has depicted here a memory from his childhood of his sister with 2 of her friends wearing Nazi-era League of Girls uniforms. And, you know, I did think about it because my family has Jewish ancestry, and we've lost a lot of our, well, most of our family in during the Second World War. And I did wonder, you know, what does it mean for me to be working on this German artist's work, and for the various things that he said about women painters, etc. And I felt, and I'd been advised by all of my mentors that, you know, maybe this isn't the project for me. But I had a moment when I was meditating that art really does need to be, for me, a place where I can encounter someone of a completely different background to me and find connection. And I'm absolutely delighted that I took on board this project where that's exactly what I've managed to find. A sense of meaning and shared concept of humanity and the roughness of us. And right in front of that work is, on the left is Ida Sophia, and on the right of me is Lindy Lee, the artist that you would have seen depicted in that earlier portrait. And Lindy Lee is one of the few Chinese artists working in Australia who I'd encountered beforehand, and also a practicing Buddhist. It is a hope for the future that we will be able to work together. On the right is a portrait of me with Shirin Neshat, and she said this week, as a West Asian, as an Iranian artist who's often asked about her identity, she said, as long as she's creating the artwork, it is Iranian, regardless of what other people's opinions are of her work. It is Iranian. And I felt that moved me quite strongly as someone who is an expat working in London, who's so far removed from Asia now, about what does it mean for my work as a curator here. And the next project I'll be working on is Yinka Shonobare's solo exhibition at Serpentine. And I first encountered his work in 2008 in Sydney at the Museum of Contemporary Art. And I suspect that this was the exhibition that transformed me from a student who was looking very specifically at art history into someone who wanted to work in contemporary art. It was his practice that taught me that this moment now is the moment where we can transform the history and those systems of racism and structural violence. And I'm really excited about this because even though he's seen as a really important Nigerian British artist, those of us who connect with Asia are also in his work, because it's his so-called African batik, which was sold to West Africa and became part of African identity by the Dutch, was originally based on Indonesian batik. And at some stage, I hope to ask him whether or not he feels that this is some form of Asian appropriation. But the point that I'm wanting to make here is about how we are present in so many different parts of contemporary art. When I was working on African art at Tate, Tate has quite a structured way of focusing research. And so I focused on performance, African art, and Australian art. And one of the areas of research I was really concerned with was about how there are many Asian migrants who moved to the continent of Africa, and where are those artists? And so the questions that we're having about invisibility of Asian British art, I feel also stories about the invisibility of Asian artists in Australia and also in Africa. And so as I'm continuing to do my research, and now I'm freed up to look more across what is happening in Britain today in contemporary art, this is certainly my intention to continue to expand my research into this area. I've shown you a very short snippet of how I've gotten to this place and where I am right now. But I would like to warmly invite anyone who's on this call or anyone who hears about it to please get in touch with me, because I am still researching and very interested to know more about what are all the different perspectives of Asian art happening in Britain. And I am beginning those moments of research. I'm starting those studio visits as a Serpentine exhibitions curator. And I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this broader conversation about what is Asian British art now. So thank you so much. I'll leave it there, knowing that I think I've definitely gone over my time. I'm so sorry. yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Jasmine.
Great, thanks very much, Tamsin. And there's just so much to talk about and also to think about in terms of projects in relation to the Serpentine, etc. Okay, so now our next speaker is Clare Chun-Yu. Clare Chun-Yu Liu will talk about the confluence between gender, migration, and participation in the contemporary British art world, drawing from her own background of initially coming to the UK for art education as an international student from Taiwan. She will share her observation and experience of identity politics, how women artists of East Asian heritage negotiate not only social values from home culture, sort of self-representation in the host country. Diaspora sets the mind free, and finding a new place and identity can be a meaningful exploration through artistic practice. Clare Chun-Yu Liu is an artist with a practice-based fine art PhD from Manchester School of Art. Clare is interested in reviewing history in relation to diasporic experience and post-colonial thinking. She explores oral history and lived experience through fiction and non-fiction to challenge the grand narratives. Her films have been screened, exhibited internationally, including at the RCA London, Ravenrow London, Oxford University, New Art Exchange Nottingham, Exis Image Forum Festival, Casteller Doc Fest, Taipei International Video Art Exhibition, Goethe Institute, Lisbon and Ming Sheng Art Museum, Beijing. Her work is in Videotage Media Arts Collection in Hong Kong. So over to you, Clare.
Hello, thank you, Jasmine, for introducing me. So I'm an artist, filmmaker, researcher, and a new lecturer. I'm originally from Taiwan, and currently I'm based in Manchester, northeast of England. So when Jasmine approached me to participate in this seminar, I had really mixed feelings and thoughts. I found it quite interesting that I was invited to talk about identity politics rather than my own art practice and research. But then I kind of realized and have been realizing kind of throughout the process in an organic way that talking about identity politics is unsettling, is uncomfortable, because we are first and foremost individuals that we actually are, rather than a categorization that we are given, or that is given by society and so forth. So I find this kind of pigeonholing and categorization very problematic. But then I'm also aware that identity politics is very problematic to talk about. But then as a solution to the problem, it's actually to talk about it. It's actually to express and share and discuss our own experience and opinion. So I feel that my position here is to address the problem by sharing my own experience as an artist and as an ex-international student, now lives in the UK. So back to the theme of today's topic, that is East Asian women artists and British contemporary art. Personally, I find these two categories quite interesting to be categorized under, because I don't necessarily see myself through such categorization, but I'm also aware that identity is also a fluid thing. And then again, my feeling is that in a wider context, the question is, what does global South even mean, in contemporary art practice, for example? And it has been in the back of my consciousness to think about a recent article on Art Review, that is, what does the global South even mean? And then as the author addresses the problematic practice of categorizing artists into groups, such as foreigner artists, artists in diaspora, global South artists. What do these tags mean? As it is problematic to pigeonhole people or pigeonhole artists in this way, but then to solve the problem, we need to talk about it. And I'm thinking that what we are doing today is to try to make this participation, this discussion, as a way to approach this identity politics problem in a porous way, in the sense that we are creating and inserting our diverse voices and experiences to the topic. And I'm going to share my reflection of my 12 years in the UK. And also, I'm going to address that my own experience as a ex-international student living in the UK might be different from what is so-called the Chinese diaspora of people, coming from the UK, people who grew up here, and then they might have different lived experience to negotiate. So I'm going to share my lived experience and observation, and also to talk about my art practice and research. So my starting point for today's discussion is to share with you my recently finished practice-based fine art PhD. So my PhD created a post-colonial reading of English chinoiserie, which was a art kind of craft movement back in the 18th century that was to mimic the Chinese motifs. So for example, in the UK, we have this willow pattern in ceramic. You can see everywhere in manor houses and also in places like Argos. They are visibly quite Chinese, this kind of blue and white ceramic pattern. But then originally they were actually a British imitation of Chinese motifs. And so my PhD reinterprets English chinoiserie from a post-colonial and diasporic perspective through artist filmmaking. So in relation to my PhD, it's interesting to look at English chinoiserie from a post-colonial perspective, because back in the 18th century, when chinoiserie was really popular, and actually the most popular, there was no British colonization of China, because the British colonization of Hong Kong only happened a century later. So a lot of my PhD was trying to figure out how to work on something from a post-colonial perspective when there was no colonization, what to do with pre-colonial contact, but from a post-colonial perspective. And so my approach to this problem was to be very philosophical. And like the quote I'm including here, Ian Ang, who is a cultural studies scholar, originally from Indonesia, but from a Chinese family. And then she moved to the Netherlands with her family when she was a teenager because of the riots in Indonesia against Chinese Indonesians. So she's of Chinese cultural heritage from Indonesia, but also Dutch, and then has been living and working in Australia for a long time. So in my PhD, I really appreciate her approach to what I just said. So here the quote says, the diasporic intellectual acts as a perpetual party pooper here because her impulse is to point to ambiguities, complexities, and contradictions, to complicate matters rather than formulate for solutions, to blur distinctions between colonizers and colonized, dominant and subordinate, oppressors and oppressed. So in my artist films, I have various historical people discussing their own individual views on chinoiserie. And then these fictional dialogues are all written by me, but based on their real lived experience. So halfway through my PhD, the pandemic happened. No one saw it coming, of course, and we were all forced to retreat to our homes. And then when we were confined to our homes, all the things happened outside in the world, especially the Black Lives Matter movement in the US that spread it to everywhere in the world, including the UK. So I think the pandemic has really changed things around race, and race and identity have since been in the foreground of both personal and public discourse, art practice and artistic discourse. So this is something I didn't see coming. And then I felt like identity politics has been really heightened ever since. And then, at least in my own experience, there has been continuous discussion with friends about identity politics, and also in public, like what we're doing now. And I think looking back, race and cultural identity were not really something I would think about as a newcomer to the UK from Taiwan. And I think in part, I didn't have the vocabulary, and I also didn't have the social and cultural context to do so as an artist and as a person. And then I think as a result of the heightened identity politics since the pandemic, there has been a really interesting phenomenon, that is the grouping of EASY, standing for East and Southeast Asian, as a group of people. So down the road in Manchester, there's a new art organization called EASY Contemporary, and it was originally CFCCA, Center for Contemporary Chinese Art, and due to some very serious political problems of institutional racism, the previous CFCCA had to close down, and then it was rebranded as EASY Contemporary. So to me, EASY for East Asian and Southeast Asian is a very new category and a very new identity. And with the whole identity politics and EASY kind of emerging, as a person, as an artist, I've been feeling more East Asian than ever. And so I think just like everyone else, like many other people, the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, identity politics were all really good factors for us to rethink, to have this soul searching journey within ourselves, So I've been looking back at my journey for my childhood on the left to the recent stage, that is just finishing my PhD, on the right on a sunny day back in this July. So I've been looking back at my own journey of pursuing a career in art as an artist, and also in academia as a lecturer. And my own experience is that I didn't do art at all before coming to the UK 12 years ago. So my whole art education and now teaching in art education as a lecturer has all happened in this country after 3 degrees and so forth. And then looking back at my own journey and also looking around, also thinking back at the degrees I have done, and then other international students who were also on the course, and also the art professionals, including artists and curators I know who are also of East Asian heritage and are all women. I've been realizing that we're all women from East Asia doing art in the UK, coming here as international students in the first place. And I've been wondering why such a demographics, why not, say, East Asian men doing art in the UK? And I slowly realized that it is because back home, we have, in general, low expectation of women. So parents are happy to send their daughters to study abroad, to studying art or curating or art history. But if their sons want to do art, either domestically or abroad, it's not allowed. And then I've been having these conversations with many female art professionals I know who are also of East Asian heritage. I think this is generally the case. And it took me a while to realize that I was actually one of them. So to me, it's a shocking realization. So I think personally, in relation to this topic of East Asian women doing art in the UK, I've been looking inwardly. So I feel that being in diaspora, being abroad, identity is something that is quite fluid. And for women, I think we have the opportunity for new imagination for ourselves in this host country, in this new environment. And I think being abroad, having studied abroad and staying on in a country like here, to me, it's like having a piece of blank paper to fill, because I don't have to deal with low expectations of me from home, from my family, from my society. I'm starting new as a person, and also as an art professional, and also as a new academic. And to me, that is very good oxygen of freedom. And I'm talking about this freedom as a source for my both art practice and research, in a sense that I do explore identity in relation to my experience in terms of the Chinese diaspora and schnozery, either directly or indirectly. And in the same time, I feel that in relation to this topic, I'm also looking outwardly, how people like me, namely women art professionals in this country of East Asian heritage, how we are perceived from the outside, from the people here who are different from us in terms of cultural heritage. And I think it's important to address the problem of essentialism. So I'm quoting Trinity Minha here from her book, When the Moon Waxes Red. So here she says, for there can hardly be such a thing as an essential inside that can be homogeneously represented by all insiders. So as a woman and other in a host country like here, it's also a task for us to think about self-representation, that is to how to negotiate how oneself is perceived, how myself is perceived. And in my experience as an artist and previously as a PhD student, now as a new lecturer, I do feel that East Asian women are generally seen as young, lesser, passive, and docile. So these are the common stereotypes. And I think we are really looking at the intersection between gender, race, and also in my experience, age, and also seniority. So my personal feeling is that I'm very often perceived as a much younger woman than I am. Of course, you can say, I'm quite well maintained, which is nice to know, and I do try hard. But my question here is, why are East Asian women overwhelmingly are perceived as lesser and as younger persons that they are? So I feel that there's a problem of infantilization, if you know what I mean. And just as I have been sharing all my experience and throwing these problems at the audience, I want to end my presentation with my recent experience. So 2 weeks ago, I went to the cinema to watch an art house film. I sat on the sofa in a cafe reading a book, and a gentleman sitting across me started to have a friendly chat with me. So he asked me what I did and so forth. And I said, I'm an artist filmmaker. I'm also lecturing at a university. And then we chatted and chatted. And then he said, so you're studying, right? And I said, yeah, I was studying. I've just finished my PhD. I'm now lecturing. And he said, oh, of course. Congratulations on your PhD. You're a doctor. And then we chatted a bit, and then he had to go. So overall, the conversation was less than 10 minutes. Just before he walked off, he said to me, you are studying, right? So it became very clear to me that because of how I looked, I would always come across as an international student to him, as part of this crowd of young East Asian women students in the street. I will always be one of them, even though I told him twice that I finished my PhD, I'm not lecturing. So this is the stereotype, and this is the essentialism that we need to talk about and address. So I'm just going to finish my bit by saying, my fellow ladies of Asian heritage and fellow female academics, how would you deal with that? And how should we deal with it? That's the end of my my part. Thank you.
Great, Claire, and that's been a really fascinating presentation, and that question at the end was just really powerful and so thought-provoking as well. I look forward to, I'm sure that we all look forward to coming back to that in the discussion. Okay, so our next presentation will be by Mario Popham, who was born in Japan to Japanese and British parents, but having spent a majority of his life in England, Mario Popham has an unresolved relationship to his dual identity. In his talk, Mario will introduce the themes that preoccupy his practice and his experience working in the UK's arts and photography world. He will ask whether such a notion as cultural essence can be detected or defined in the work of artists who have been long disconnected from their roots, touching on his desire to reconnect with Japan before exploring the work of photographic artists from Asia, many who also occupy this duality. Mario Popham is a photographic artist drawn to exploring our paradoxical relationship to the natural environment and how this finds expression in post-industrial areas of Britain and abroad. He's currently developing long-term projects in both the UK and Italy that explore place in the context of industrial legacy, nature, and community, and is currently artist in residence with Open Eye Gallery. As a freelance curator, Mario has delivered a number of contemporary photography exhibitions in the UK, working with organisations such as Open Eye Gallery, Home Manchester, and Castlefield Gallery, Manchester. So great, over to you, Mario.
Thank you, Jasmine. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me, Jasmine. Yeah, delighted to be here today. But yeah, like Claire, I was a little mystified when I first received the email to invite me. I was having read the description, I wasn't quite sure I fit the criteria really as a well, firstly, as I'm not a woman, and also, yeah, I very rarely consider myself as an Asian artist, I suppose. And I'll go into perhaps why that is. And obviously that's something that's been on my mind, really, as far as back as I can remember. But yeah, it's surprising to be referred to as that, or yeah, to be defined in such a way. So, but the more I thought about it, the more interesting it became that I was asked, really. So yeah, as Jasmine said, it's going to consist of a bit about myself, and then my practice as well, and perhaps we can see if we can detect any of my heritage in there at the moment. But then talking about what led me here, and then I wanted to introduce all of you to some artists that I really admire, who actually that duality, that hybridity, if you like, is much more pronounced and much more prominent within their practice, and yeah, who are a source of inspiration for me. So, and I'm a photographer, I'm a photographic artist and curator. So yeah, I'll be showing you a lot of images. And yeah, as my students know, I'm quite image heavy with my PowerPoint. So here comes the bombardment anyway. So here's a bit about myself. Now that I was born in Kamakura, Japan, some of you might have heard of it. It's an old capital. It's an old former capital city of Japan, and a very religious center. So that wasn't PowerPoint just adding a bit of clip art there. That's actually the famous Buddha from my town, which fills me with great nostalgia whenever I see it. And yeah, I moved to Japan when I was 9, and yeah, moved to London. So it was quite a shock to come from Japan and then thrown into the streets of South London. And but as children do or can do, I adapted fairly quickly. And yeah, I was pleased to find that everyone there was a lot of it's a real mix of people that were in my primary school, and in that sense, I fit in with all the difference that was apparent there. So So yeah, I kind of adapted, changed my accent from American to London, and yeah, and ever since then, really, I gradually assimilated with the British way of doing things, and yeah, I felt British as far back as I can remember, I guess, and that's kind of eclipsed my sense of my perception of me being Japanese. Obviously, I've had my difference pointed out to me on occasion, some in jest, or some fairly out of ignorance, or occasionally with hostility, but not enough to drown out the sense that I was British and I was quite accepted where I found myself. So yeah, my Japaneseness became more of an interesting feature of my Britishness. Obviously, my mum has been great as being a bridge to my Japaneseness, and she was my Japanese community, if you like. And so yeah, I can see that Japaneseness has been fading over time, and it's been swallowed by this kind of nebulous thing we call Britishness, I guess, and being in its shadow. So yeah, I'm perhaps very fortunate in this case, and I'm sure, yeah, there's as wonderful as multicultural that this multicultural project is. It's imperfect, and I think I've been very fortunate in a sense that a lot of work has been done over the last decades, and for me to feel British and yeah, to be accepted, really. And obviously this progress has to be we have to be vigilant about it, and it has to be defended, obviously, in light of recent comments from those in government at the moment. So yeah, I imagine this is quite a common experience for those who have migration in their histories, that this kind of Britishness tends to take over in the nicest possible way. So yeah, after moving to London, I ended up eventually moving to Manchester, where again it's an incredibly diverse city, and yeah, I felt very much at home in that very multicultural, cosmopolitan sort of mix, really, and I made this my home ever since. So I came to study photography, and eventually graduated in 2007. My first love was film studies, and I skipped over to photography, having discovered the darkroom. And yeah, ever since then, just be carving my way through into the photography and art world. And now today I divide my time between my artistic practice, lecturing, and curating. So this, just to quickly introduce you to some of the curatorial work I do. I came quite latterly to curation, and kind of by accident, really. I worked for an arts organization in Greater Manchester, and started doing small curatorial jobs for them, and eventually they allowed me to put on photography shows and actually steer the way in that direction. This is the latest exhibition I put together for Open Eye Gallery, and it's actually in Wigan and Lee, which is on the outskirts of Manchester, and where they're extending their remit from Liverpool to Wigan and Lee. And this was different narratives around changing climate, featuring emerging and early career photographers. This is another exhibition I put together in 2021, and yeah, titled She Appeared to Vanish, where I worked with 4 female photographers, using photography and experimental methods to disrupt, subvert, and confront notions of the male gaze. So yeah, another project in which I felt somewhat of an imposter, really, but fascinating to work on. And tandem to this, I've been this is my own photographic practice. This is from an ongoing project called Strange Eden, which is, again, it's taking place in Wigan and Lee, looking at an ex-colliery and now rewilded as a nature reserve. And yeah, it's It's part of a project called the Carbon Landscape, where they're trying to rewild these areas and decontaminate these areas and bring biodiversity back. So it's a deeply ironic kind of place, really, because it's kind of ground zero of industrial revolution. Is where it all happened initially, and contributing to the environmental difficulties we're now facing, and it's now being rewilded and rehabilitated by various organizations. So I'm looking at how human nature is enmeshed with non-human nature in the aftermath of the industrialization here, and it's part of a residency I'm taking part with at Open Eye Gallery, and it will enter its experimental phase, informed by research. Again, this is from Strange Eden as well. It's a kind of idea of the re-emergence of nature. And here are semi-abstractions and diptychs, again looking at that nature and human nature, non-human nature melding into each other in a sense. And I guess the main point I'm making is that human nature is not an aberration, but we're kind of ultimately indivisible from nature. And that's the idea I'm exploring. Over in Italy, I'm actually in parallel with all of this. I'm working on this project it's a collaboration with my half Italian brother. So he's half British and half Italian, just to add to that hybridity, if you like. And it's about an alpine valley in the northwest of Italy and its communities, and who are in the kind of pursuit of a good life in accord with nature and trying to rehabilitate this landscape, this post-industrial landscape there. This is Paolo. He's actually migrated himself from the south of Italy up to the north and taken stewardship of this old chestnut grove. And this is all taking place in the shadow of this top-down infrastructure imposed on the natural environment there, and the militarization of the area. And yes, obviously, it raises debates between progress and conservation that we find ourselves in, and that the bind of the Anthropocene, really, where these conflicting ideas on what progress should be. So this was fascinating because in that exploring one's roots sense, as my brother's roots that he's exploring, and he's an anthropology PhD student just about to complete, and he told me about this story that he's pursuing, and I was spellbound. So it's one where we've actually forged I'm 13 years older than him, so this was an incredible opportunity to kind of bond, really, and become brothers. So I would like to do something similar, really, as my brother has done, and explore that history and immerse myself in my own distant kind of roots, really. So looking back at my practice, it's not been a prominent part of my practice, and it's a sum of a variety of influences, both East and West, as can be illustrated here. I mean, early on, I was very interested in the work of Edward Hopper and Hiroshige there, who's a peer of Hokusai, who we saw earlier, and L.S. Lowry from the north, obviously, and Rinko Kawauchi there, a photographer working in Japan, and all sharing. Once you put them side by side, they all do share this sense of formalism. They're all interested in this, in where human nature fits within the larger nature as well. So I can see parallels there, but it's really hard to detect one thing or another. I mean, looking back at these images, they certainly don't touch on any themes around Asia, but on a purely aesthetic and formal sense, perhaps we can detect something. I've been told, but that this is just anecdotal, really, that people can see some kind of trace of some Japanese influence or aesthetics, but yeah, again, it's very subjective. And so, yeah, I really loved how Clare put it in the description of her speech. The diaspora sets the mind free, finding a new place and identity can be a meaningful exploration through artistic practice. Yeah, that really resonates with me, and that's something I like to put in practice. But with diaspora in kind of reverse, I guess I'll be a stranger in Japan. I mean, yeah, it's the reason that, well, one of the reasons why my parents decided to raise me in Britain was, correct me here if I'm wrong, Mum. I think she's in the audience, but yeah, it's that British had this very open attitude to culture, whereas Japan is a very homogenous society, and I don't think there's any malice or overt xenophobia there, really. I think it's more, from what I detected, it's more you are seen as a curiosity, really, and yeah, the difference is my ambiguity in terms of how I look is regarded as something, yeah, something as a difference, really. So so it would be interesting for me to spend my formative years there, how I would have fit in, if I would have fit in as readily. So yeah, I'm quite grateful in the sense that I live in Britain, and yeah, that this identity is not something which I've agonized over, really. So yeah, so I do have some plans to go to Japan eventually, once I've boxed these various projects off. I'd love to do a practice-led PhD looking at these two. There's obviously symmetries between the two countries. They're both island nations. They're both ex-imperial nations dealing with the kind of fallout from their loss of power. And yeah, I think there's and as a way to explore my own background as well. So yeah, I've got the bare bones or something, maybe that I need to dig into. So that leads me on to these other artists who I just like to touch on, really, who have inspired me. And yeah, they're largely predominantly based around photography as their practice. And so, yeah, we'll move on to the work of Yan Preston. Now, Yan's fantastic. I'm lucky enough to have her as a peer and an occasional mentor. She grew up, she's Chinese. She grew up in China, studied in China, has a background in medicine, but came to the arts, and now is a lecturer and a practicing artist, and has established herself in a landscape tradition in the last few years. And she now lives in Todmorden, which is in Yorkshire, just very close to Manchester. And this is a work that really announced her arrival. So this is Mother River. This is an epic project which spans the length of the Yangtze River, which yeah, snakes its way through China, and it documents it from its source all the way to its mouth, and it not only conveys a journey through geographic space, but one that seems to trace a journey through time, really. So we start off in non-human environment there, uninhabitable, snowy, ice-capped environment there, and then eventually, obviously, I've bookended this, and there are lots of fabulous images in between these two. And she approached this very methodically. So every 1,000 kilometers, she'd take an image. And yeah, I think it's some of a scientific background in medicine, where she has this quite systematic, methodical approach, and then finds poetry within those parameters. And so yeah, we kind of see that charting really of China's progress progressively through this series. Okay, this is the next project that she produced, called Forest. And again, it's a somewhat ironic title, and it looks at the commodification and control of nature through transplanting of trees and landscaping of urban space on an epic scale in China. So the movement of nature and that kind of designing and that control of nature, and that incongruity of this highly managed and idealized implementation of nature-based solutions. And she's adopted a very neutral form approach that aimed for objectivity, and which it's a long-standing tradition that was practiced by initially by Western photographers, and happened in tandem with empire, really, and that camera was developed as a tool, very much in connection to that imperial development of Western nations. So yeah, she's adopted that methodology and applied it to this rising power of a nation of China. And this is on a completely different note. I think she's felt a little frustrated at the limitations, perhaps, of photography, and having produced two very rigorous landscape projects, she turned her attention to her new home in Todmorden. And during COVID, she happened across this rhododendron bush near her home, and there wasn't much else you could do in terms of photography. We're all confined to our homes, so she took it upon herself to photograph this, almost like just like a ritual, really. Every other day, I think it was, it took hundreds of visits to this particular rhododendron specimen, and yeah, started identifying with this plant, which has its roots in in colonial times. It was brought back to this nation by British Empire, and initially his attitude towards it has completely shifted from one of admired kind of curiosity, exotic curiosity, to one that's been feared and reviled as an invasive species latterly. So yes, 182 ritualistic walks she took. So and again, using her large format camera. So it was, which is a ritual in itself. It requires, it's quite a labor intensive camera to use, and in all conditions. And alongside that, she started looking further into that specimen and dissecting it, really, and digging for meaning from this one tiny slice of a landscape. So very different from the kind of expansive view that she took in China. And she developed lots of different approaches to extracting meaning from this. And so we have two experimental pieces here. She's recently shown this work in Huddersfield University, where she works. That they gave her a space where she could show all these experimental pieces. I think it's the first time that she's been able to put all these elements together and to see how they sit alongside each other. So there are video pieces here, there are these quite sculptural pieces on light boxes that have been produced together with textile artists. So she's working in, she's really being very playful here, and she's stretching her practice really. And yeah, so on the left we have flowers from the plant itself in varying states of decay, sculpted in elliptical shape, reminiscent of a vulva. And yeah, in the second one, she was actively burning some of these seeds here, and she had a growing identification with this plant and its constituent parts, with her own experience as a migrant and a woman. And yeah, it's very inspiring just to see how much she's changed with this project, because it just goes to show, as Claire was saying, that yeah, identity is not fixed, and nor are we fixed as artists, really. So yeah, I'm intending to take a note out of that book, really, as on especially on the work in Wigan that I'm producing. Okay, I'm conscious I've gone over time a little bit, but I'll show you one more artist if you've got appetite for it, left for it. So we'll look at Anne Miley, who's another photographer who's had a big impact on me, and made extraordinary work about her dual lineage in Vietnam and the US. So Anne Miley again uses a quite an objective, almost passive kind of style where she allows the whole frame to, it's a kind of clear-eyed, unaffected way of seeing that grants kind of equal importance to all areas of the frame, really. And she was traveling back to Vietnam. She experienced the war in Vietnam, fled the war, her family fled the war, and she eventually found herself in America, and she wanted to explore her history. Obviously a very complicated history with America, her new home. So she went out with a very open mind to explore this landscape, this bucolic landscape that was in her imagination, really. So it's obviously been inflected, her imagination being inflected by popular culture and movies, and she wanted to see how that reality meets with that image of it in her imagination. And again, yeah, looking at these traces of this agricultural landscape. And I love this image because this is this kind of extraordinary flux of activity, and then this perfectly still family portrait in the middle of the image there. And she has an optimal distance to show the kind of landscape and the people who populate it. Likewise here, capturing these contemplative moments, the stillness in a world of flux. Having made this huge body of work in Vietnam, she turned a lens to America, and yeah, this actually looks like a battle scene. This is an image from the project Small Wars, where there was a riddle of how do you actually photograph history? I mean, it's past, so without working with archives, etc., how do you reference history? So she thought of a way around by contacting these reenactment enthusiasts who would recreate the Vietnam War in the American landscape, and she contacted them, was very upfront with them about her background, and they welcomed her in for the authenticity that she brought to this spectacle. So yeah, it's kind of war stage as theatre and borrowing from popular culture again, and this kind of element of time travel. And yeah, it's kind of further mythologized through these images, this the war and the history. the shared history, really. She would actually actively be involved in these reenactments, again, adding this authenticity to the proceedings. And yeah, here she is as a Viet Cong sniper. And again here, now I don't know if they're in character here or if it's this behind the scenes, but it's an image that's full of, yeah, irony really and contradiction again. So it's almost like a quiet, tender moment between two individuals. And she said, yeah, a lot of the men had Vietnam in their past. Some of their fathers or uncles or members of family have been involved in Vietnam, or they were previously in the army themselves and dealing with their own trauma in a sense. So it was this, yeah, there's something interesting about, yeah, these two individuals from the conflict divide having this sense of shared trauma and dealing with that shared trauma in a sense. And I love the fact that the work doesn't really sentimentalize this process, really. It takes that kind of cool distance from it and allows us to reflect. So, okay, there was another artist. I got completely carried away, but I think we'll leave it there. I do urge you to go and seek out Yunjin Lee, who's a Korean and American photographer. But yeah, it's been delightful putting that together because yeah, curating is something I've neglected for a while. So it felt like I was bringing together artists and making these connections between them. So yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for your time. If you have any questions about my practice or your these artists, then happy to answer them. And yes, I would recommend Jan Preston being involved in any future iterations of this.
Yeah, great. So that's such an interesting presentation. Thanks to all three of you for having such fascinating ideas, and so I think now we can open up to the Q&A, and if you'd like to ask any questions, then please feel free to write in the chat, and then I can keep an eye on that. There's a question already. And there's some quite interesting comments in the chat, and thought-provoking. As a young white British child until the mid-1950s, I lived in colonial Singapore, a formative experience that remains core of my identity. It's enlightening to compare my reverse experience with those of the speakers. I think while people think of questions, I could start with three. I guess what do you all understand by the notion of cultural hybridity?
I'm not sure whether or not, like how to even start on the notion of hybridity, because I'm a bona fide mongrel, as we describe them in Australia. It's not hybrid, it's incredibly complex. And what I love about the contemporary moment as we're exploring what is identity, even if you come from two allegedly distinctive nations, we are constantly in dialogue with each other. Like we've just mentioned Singapore, and Charlotte, I think I mentioned before that my grandfather is Chinese Singaporean, and anyone who's been to Singapore will know that in Singapore, even though interracial marriages were not so common as they are now, you would have the Arab Quarter, you'd have the Indian section, Chinese section, Malay section, all linking to each other, often unifying and fusing around food. But that's like a really good example of like one nation, for instance, of many cultures. And it's very distinctive of Southeast Asia and how there's always been this long history of trade. And how it's linked up with all these other bigger nations and those long histories. So the idea of cultural hybridity, I feel like this idea of dualism is part of the problem of the colonial thinking. And I don't know what Claire and Mario think about that, although I'm seeing a few nods. So I'm hoping that might resonate with yourselves as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I do find it perhaps a little bit of a reductive way to look at my own experience, perhaps, but it's an interesting lens to it has been an interesting lens just to examine myself, I guess, and my background for sure. But yeah, it's a really complex identities. It's a real complex kind of hodgepodge of things, and it's just one way to dissect it, I think.
Yeah, I see identity not as something fixed for anyone or any group or any categorization of individuals. I do take identity not seriously, but philosophically and also lightly, in the sense that I think it's a very porous thing. And as it is porous and problematic, it requires discussion, it requires deliberation, and it requires constant re-examination of it. I see lightly in the sense that I don't really give myself any tags. Interestingly, when I go to the continent, the European continent, to be part of art or academic events, sometimes the people on the continent count me as a British participant. And then when it has happened a few times that if the event is held in English and then there's no native English speakers participating, and then I'm automatically seen as the only native English speaker just because I live in the UK. But even though I actually grew up in Taiwan and my first language is actually Mandarin, so I find this kind of identity fluidity really interesting, and I see it lightly in the sense that I enjoy the fluidity, but I also want to discuss it personally in public and also as part of my art practice. But then I think there's also a potentially dangerous side to it, that is, as someone who is not European, not British, and non-white, and coming from the so-called global South, even though the definition of global South is very problematic, because when I checked on the internet, Taiwan is not part of the global South. I don't know why. But anyways, what I'm saying is that I think there's a danger to this problem. That is, basically, if you're not white, you must work on identity. You must join the discussion. I find it problematic because I think anything compulsory is a bit too forceful. I think we need to respect each person's individual approach to it. And then that's, in a wider picture, the porous nature of the discussion of identity and identity itself.
And there's another interesting comment in the chat as well. As a female artist, London-born, from Japanese and English parents, I found them incredibly relatable. I'm not sure if the answer to Claire's question, still figuring it out.
Well, I had a quick question here as well to Tamsin. Hi, Tamsin and Claire and Mario, thank you so much. I'm Bindu Mehra and I'm co-convener of this project as well, along with Jasmir. And I was raised in India and studied in the United States, lived in Canada, and now I'm here in UK pursuing my PhD at the Slade School of Fine Arts as well. So I had a quick question, which was in reference to, I was reading about you, Tamsin, and some of the interviews which you had, write-ups about you and your research projects. And what really intrigued me was when you said that art could represent ideas, not just a literal interpretation of the world. And you were looking at how hybrid bodies, chimeras, and monsters, cyborgs, avatars, amongst other images, might be useful metaphors for the other in the society. So could you speak a little bit more about that? Because with the increasing use of technology in our society, do you feel that this othering could continue to grow and expand vis-a-vis the diaspora?
Very interesting. You're drawing from a long time ago when I was in Belfast, and I was working at the Norton Gallery for a very brief period of time between my masters and when I started at Tate Modern. And yeah, it's an interesting idea about the place of technology. And actually, at the moment, we've got an exhibition by Gabriel Massan at Serpentine, which was developed by our arts tech team. And it's looking at Blackness from the perspective of Brazilian artists who work in analog materials, but have co-created collectively a video game, and different artists have been involved in different levels that have been created for the exhibition. And then alongside the game are some of the three-dimensional objects. And Gabriel Massan's a very interesting artist thinking about this space, because they themselves identify as non-binary. So they're looking at queerness within Black cultures in Brazil, which of course is Black majority. And it's a really exciting moment in Brazil. Sao Paulo Biennial has been directed for the first time by Black directors. And this is seen as a really transformative moment. So that's an example of the way in which artists are looking at technology. I think the thing is that for me personally, as someone who works across so many different disciplines, what I would argue is that digital platforms are just a new form of technology, and artists have always been at the forefront of thinking about technology and its different uses. And what excites me about different materials and different ways of making and thinking is less about the specifics of the new and the exciting, and more about how different modes of visual practice can articulate that which is very specific. Like I'm very excited about artists who understand how to use the material to create meaning. Sometimes you can see people just sort of playing around with different materials because it's in vogue, the NFT thing, like, oh my God, there was so much misogyny and racism in the, the so-called blue chip artists that came out from that moment. And honestly, the more of that I saw, the less interested I was in that space. But then, it's just a matter of artists who I know are going to pick up on that and are going to critique it and are going to do something really interesting with that. I'm not so curious about the fad. What I am curious about is how artists use the media to make commentary on that specific area. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
It's interesting is because recently I went back, I was thinking of, I was working with another organization on a collaborative project with them and working with marginalized women, especially girl child in India, and how they are, on one hand you have is, young women, a lot of young women, even middle-aged women and elderly women as well, who for them it's a medium of expression for themselves, the technology. And on the other hand, it's expression for themselves and also in terms of their own identity as a woman. And on the other hand, you have girl child, they do not have the rights or very limited rights to use the internet or even the cell phones. So, there's a lot of contradiction which is going on. And I like what Claire said as well, as, I was looking at some of her videos, which was really interesting. She's using these multiple voices in her work, which is, and she builds these multiple narratives, which are kind of not narratives, multiple voices, which she's using in her videos, and which makes it really interesting because place becomes, in that sense, very important. The history becomes very important. Whose perspective that you're coming in from becomes very important. And then when you put all of that within the context, it's something. It leads to so many different kinds of questions in one's mind. But, yeah.
There's another comment as well. Thank you, Bindu. In the chat as well, and this discussion has been fascinating and resonates with my experience. And I'm mixed race, but I'm perceived as white British for my appearance. But when I say I'm Mexican, I'm challenged in unexpected ways. It's as if some people refuse to accept me perceiving myself as Mexican over perceiving myself as British. I get told a lot that if I was born in the UK, then I am definitely British, even though I grew up in Mexico and moved back here as an adult. I'm also wondering about how, this is for Claire, how has teaching fed into your understanding of your art practice, and how does one practice inform the other as well? So
yeah, so truth be told, I've been teaching for just over 2 weeks. I'm starting my new career as a lecturer after having finished my PhD. So I do feel that it's a bit too soon to conclude, to wrap up any ideas. Yeah, but my personal feeling is that I spent 7 years living in London, doing my MFA with you, actually, Jasmine, at Wimbledon College of Art. It's actually how we met. It was quite a few years ago.
2015.
And then I think I spent my formative years in this country, mainly in London. And then I was really lucky to get the full scholarship to do my practice-based fine art PhD at Manchester School of Art. So I've been looking at the Chinese diaspora, both in London and then up north here. But my personal experience is that there's a relatively lack of interest in other cultures, including the Chinese diaspora in Manchester. That's my personal feeling. I don't know whether this is very objective, but then I think talking about other cultures, especially cultures that are from quite far away, we are not talking about going to France, we're not talking about being a Spanish person in the UK or something like that. If you talk about cultures that are really far away, my feeling is that it's a very cosmopolitan thing. And I do feel strongly, personally, that it's really much more celebrated in London because it's so diverse. You can say that Manchester is diverse as well, which is very true. But I'm talking about diverse in the sense that there are many people coming over here as adults, and also people of migratory background, but born here. I'm talking about diversity, but at a more detailed levels. And I think in London we have more diversity in terms of that. So people are in general more interested in other cultures. At least that's what I can observe in the cultural sector.
Yeah.
If I might add, Claire, it's really interesting hearing your insights. And yes, I definitely shared those frustrations when I was in Canberra, which is, one of the most highly cultured, well, what do I want to use here? It's one of the most highly educated populations. It's, most people have at least 2 degrees. The average age is 30s, etc. Very difficult to challenge white culture, though, because it's almost like using education against you. And because you're so educated, it sometimes I feel, and this is something I think about on my own self, is like sometimes we can feel a little bit too confident in our own education and forget to be open-minded and surprised by new encounters and perspectives. But I was just going to say, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about as we were all speaking, because I think, you know, we've touched on Black Lives Matter. It's interesting that, you know, this has come up in this conversation. And one of the things I found very challenging about that moment was that there was such a huge response to George Floyd's death. And then 39 Vietnamese people died in the back of a lorry, and there weren't huge protests across the globe about these 39 deaths. And it's very clear to me that some deaths resonate more strongly than others. And yet I would argue very clearly that those 39 Vietnamese people, somewhere as young as 15, they also died because of systemic violence. And it's something that that I feel is very frustrating when we're talking about Asian identity, that our deaths, for some reason, are not talked about as much as others. I don't know if other people agree with that, but it just strikes me as part of the conversation around whose deaths are preventable, whose are predictable, whose are accepted. Yeah, Bindu, what you've said about Judith Butler and slow violence, very interesting.
I just wanted to add that we're talking about exploring other cultures is a very cosmopolitan practice. And then in the case of this country, it's much more celebrated in London, particularly. And in my experience of living in Manchester, I feel that when I talk about my art practice of exploring the Chinese diaspora and the post-colonial thinking, I feel like I'm okayed. People okay me. It's not a problem. I don't feel being treated in any so-called racist way, but it's not. There's a lack of participation in my discussion, and then artistically, this situation actually has reminded me of the photographic Polaroid works by Ingrid Pollard. You know, previously she explored being a Black British person living in rural UK, and then she took photos of herself in rural settings, you know. So that has become the back of my consciousness, thinking that, is that what I'm going to do next? Because this is kind of my experience. I'm not being sarcastic, I'm being genuine. Yeah, so there is a kind of a cosmopolitan divide within this country when it comes to exploring cultural identity in the British context.
And I think it's very interesting considering hybridities, like they're very fluid in terms of identity, and how it seems like different spaces are coming in together with each other. Any more questions before we nearly finish? I've got a couple more questions before we do. Not a question, but wanted to say it's been wonderful to have access to this conversation. I was born in South Africa. My dad is white British and my mother is mixed South African with a Filipino German mother and South African Indonesian father. Their Asian roots were present in our food and communities, but the culture was never spoken about. It is something I've always wondered about, and now after this, I feel like I know how to approach that conversation of the Asian cultural influence in Africa. I was interested if you could say more about the symmetry within about the two countries of Britain and Japan as well, Mario, that you mentioned at the end of your presentation. That would be interesting to hear more about.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, really, just to consider, for myself to consider my two grandfathers, they were fighting on opposite sides when these colonial powers clashed. And yeah, so yeah, it's interesting to be the next generation out of that, really. And yeah, and in terms of, yeah, they're both oppressive countries in their history. So and how both have been dealing with that, and with that reckoning, I guess, in the past century, in the past half century, is fascinating. And yeah, I would like to explore this further. Obviously, this is something I'm at the very beginnings of. So yeah, it's but it would be interesting to explore that through my own family history and through the wider history, really, of the two nations. Yeah.
So any more questions? Great. Before we, yeah, Claire.
Yes, Mia. Can I ask you how you formulated this idea of combining East Asian and South Asian and also women artists in the context of contemporary British art? You'd be really interesting to know your thoughts on it, because like I mentioned in my slides, in my presentation, the concept of EASY, standing for East and Southeast Asian, is a new concept, it's a new identity, it's a new grouping. And I think many people, including myself, are grappling with it, not in a bad way, in a way that we want to further the discussion, to enrich the discussion, to point out problems. Yeah, so I'm just wondering how you grouped these two categories together and why.
I feel that British South Asian art and East Asian art has been arguably marginalised also within museums and galleries, and also within institutions as well. And this research group, Shai that I formulated with fellow PhD candidate Bindu Mehra, explored the insufficient exposure of Asian British artists in exhibitions and other projects. And what you were also saying earlier, Claire, about the idea of pigeonholing, is that at the same time I want to bring awareness to the sense of marginalisation, but there's also a sense of myself wanting to avoid being pigeonholed and also stereotyped as well. But what's interesting to me is that there can be people can sometimes have limitations on what South Asian and East Asian artists can produce as artists. Like they can only produce South Asian art rather than all types of art in terms in terms of subject matter. And I think the group itself is to explore these reasons, including why British Asian artists and exhibitions are underrepresented, and also in raising awareness of this in the British art world as well. Because I find I can sometimes, because I'm from a mixed British South Asian background, and I sometimes feel like I neither belong in either one or the other culture in my own artistic practice, in my painting practice at the same time. So I'm exploring through my artistic practice a sense of alienation and also dislocation navigating between different spaces in my works as well, such as and looking at those issues primarily through the urbanscapes that I explore in my works, primarily painting. And
just like to just to add on to what Claire said earlier, yeah, I'm really, I was happy to see that recalibration of a gallery, really, from something which was very very kind of monocultural, China-centric to broadening out to an East Asia. I think that can only be a healthy thing. Yeah. And also, I love that idea that you had of Ingrid Pollard update from your perspective. I think that would be fascinating, particularly in the context of the Japan that you've described from your perspective. I think it's, yeah, I think it's overdue that. Yeah, that would be interesting.
If I might add something that I'm observing in terms of funding streams and therefore research streams, yes, it is really important to look at, you know, Asia as a concept broader than China, but there's still very much a north-south divide that exists in Asia, as well as, like, just broadly speaking across the globe. I feel that we've got a long road ahead of ourselves to broaden out Asian identity, let alone just getting Asian art onto the table in the first place, but then to look at the complexity of the multitudes of different Asian cultures and making sure that the tick box isn't always filled with the majority, and that it's much more complex, and there's so much going on further south. It's, yes, and also thinking about what infrastructure is available, you know, who's running what spaces and why. I also want to, you know, make sure that there continues to be space for people to explore, like, not to always have to fall on identity politics as part of their artistic practice in order to tick that identity politics. That you know, I love, for instance, that I worked with curators who did not have a cultural background but specialized in, you know, Middle Eastern art and North African art, or, you know, Latin American specializing in South Asian art. Like, I do think that this is really important as well, that we bring different stories to the research and the work that we do. So yeah, there's so much more to explore, and then of course how that intersects with gender, particularly in spaces where gender is still considered in binary terms, and it's politically unsafe in certain countries to be in the non-binary spaces, and how that then is brought into our diasporic communities. Yeah, I think there's so much that can be explored under so many different frameworks. It's really great to bring this open.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So
yeah, I'd echo that. Really, just, I think it's very important for us to work together across boundaries and a sharing of these perspectives rather than being siloed in our compartments. Yeah. So
yeah, well, thank you, Jasmine. I mean, and you know, we really need to think at this point of, instead of, yeah, identity politics, as much as we do not want to be a part of it, but yeah, we do get sort of pigeonholed the moment, you know, I left India, and the moment I left, I went into the master's program, and a very prestigious university, and a program director is saying, make it red, make it more Indian. And I was absolutely flabbergasted. So we do get pigeonholed, which is the reality. But at the end of the day, so, you know, we need to open this dialogue and saying that, well, you know, talk about it and address that. And I think the kind of platform that we have is in a sense, it creates that opportunity for artists, and especially for women, to talk about it. And so why do we need to just kind of focus purely on South Asian artists? Let us make the open it up further so that more people are engaged and participate in that, and take it forward from there. We don't know what's going to come out of it, but hopefully it's you know, raising all these very, very interesting conversations with everyone. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
So many thanks from myself and Bindu and Natasha and Tamsin, Clare and Mario Sana and Jenny Go, who has provided tech support, and also to everyone who came and listened and also contributed to the Q&A. It's been a really great event, and I've really enjoyed engaging with the discussions, and I very much hope that we can continue these dialogues in the future. So great. So thank you all so much, and thanks to everyone for coming. So thanks.
Thank you, Jasmine.